She did not scream when they killed her husband. She couldn't. The sound had left her body the same moment he did. One breath, one crack of a rifle, and the man she had built her entire life around crumpled into the tall grass like something the wind had simply decided to put down. She stood there, 3 feet away, her hand still holding the water bucket she had been carrying to the horses. The bucket was still in her hands. She would think about that later, the fact that she did not drop it. The fact that her hands kept holding something even after everything else let go. His name was Thomas. He had rough hands and a quiet laugh, and he used to hum while he worked the fence posts. Always the same 3 notes, never a full song. She had teased him about it for 11 years. She would never tease anyone about anything again. They came fast after the shot. She ran, and there wasn't anything else to do. No weapon, no horse close enough, no neighbor within shouting distance. The frontier wasn't a place that offered you options when things went wrong. It offered you legs, and it offered you luck, and on that afternoon in the late summer of 1868, Martha Calloway had only one of those 2 things working in her favor. She ran toward the river, not because it was safe, because it was pretty much the only direction they weren't. What basically happened next, what pulled her back from the water's edge with the current already around her ankles? The weight of grief already dragging her under in ways that had nothing to do with the river, isn't a story about rescue. Isn't a story about a woman who was saved. It is a story about a woman who chose to live and the Cheyenne warrior who arrived in the exact moment that choice was hardest to make. This is what really happened. Witchy morning had started the way most mornings did on the Calloway homestead, with work. There was always work. In the years since Martha and Thomas had come west from Ohio, with 2 horses, a wagon full of tools, and the kind of optimism that only the young and the foolish carry across 1,000 miles of open country, they had learned that the frontier did not reward rest. It rewarded stubborn, unbroken effort, repeated every single day, without complaint. So that was what they gave it. Martha had been up before the sun. She always was. The chickens needed feeding before the heat came. The garden needed water drawn from the well before the ground got too hard, and the bread needed to be set to rise early or it would not be ready before Thomas came in for the midday meal. She moved through, these tasks the way she moved through most things with a quiet, no-nonsense efficiency that her mother had called a gift and her older sister had called exhausting. Martha had always thought they were both right. Thomas had gone out to check the north fence line. He did this every few days because the cattle had a habit of finding the weak spots and wandering, and a wandering cow on the frontier was a lost cow more often than not. He took his rifle, as he always did, not because he expected trouble, but because a man who didn't take his rifle somewhere in that country in that year was a man who had decided the world was safer than it was. Thomas wasn't that kind of man. He was careful. He was steady. He was the sort of person you trusted without thinking about why, the same way you trusted the sun to come up or the river to run. Martha was at the well, drawing the second bucket, when she heard the shot. It was a single sound, which clean and flat and final, the way rifle shots always are when they mean something permanent. She had heard shots before, animals, mostly, and once a confrontation between 2 homesteaders over a disputed claim 3 miles north that had ended badly for both parties. She sort of knew the difference between a shot fired in passing and a shot that changed the shape of a day. This one changed the shape of everything. She did not run immediately. There's a moment when something terrible happens, where the mind simply refuses to accept the information the ears are giving it. It isn't cowardice. It is, biology, the brain protecting itself from data it isn't yet equipped to process. Martha stood at the well for what felt like a long time, but was probably no more than 5 or 6 seconds, the bucket handle in her right hand. The rope still swinging slightly where she had let it go. The morning air carrying the smell of dry grass, and the distant sound of her own heartbeat getting louder. Then she heard the voices in not English, not sort of the voices of men she knew. She moved then, and not toward the sound, away from it, but not running, not yet, because something instinctive in her knew that movement attracted attention, and she was still close enough to the well house that she had cover. She pressed herself against the rough wood siding and looked north, toward where Thomas had gone that morning, toward the fence line and the open grass beyond it. She saw him from a distance of perhaps 200 yards. He was on the ground, which he wasn't moving, The cattle were scattered wide, which meant something had spooked them badly, and she could see two riders moving in the far grass. Cheyenne, she was almost certain, by the way they sat their horses, by the markings she had seen in the brief, wary exchanges of the trading post over the past year. The tensions between the army and the Cheyenne had been building all summer. Everyone on the frontier knew it. Everyone had been hoping it would not come to their particular piece of land. Hope, Martha was learning, was a thing you held until you couldn't. She did not cry. She thought about this later and felt guilty about it. The absence of immediate tears, as though her body had already made a decision about what the priority was, and grief wasn't it. The priority was survival. Plus, the priority was the next 10 minutes, not the rest of her life, because the rest of her life would only exist if she got through the next 10 minutes first. Thomas would have told her the same thing. He was practical that way. Like, she held on to that. The riders had not seen her. They were moving northeast now, toward the barn, which meant they were coming toward the homestead. She had perhaps 2 minutes, maybe less. The house had a rifle, Thomas's spare, hanging above the door, but the riders were between her and the house. The well house, for what it's worth, had nothing useful. The tool shed behind her had an axe and a pitchfork, but a woman alone against 2 armed riders with only a pitchfork wasn't a fight. It was a death performed more slowly. She ran south, toward the river. The grass was tall, good cover, bad footing. She ran low, staying below the line where the stalks bent against the sky, using the angle of the slope to keep herself out of sight from the direction of the barn. She wasn't a fast runner under normal circumstances, but fear is a remarkable accelerant. She covered the quarter-mile to the river's edge in a time that would have surprised her if she had been counting, which she wasn't. I think she wasn't counting anything. She was just moving. The river was the smoky hill, running fast from the rains they'd had 2 weeks earlier. It wasn't deep along the bank, maybe chest height at the center channel, but the current was strong, the kind that looks calm on the surface, and has an entirely different opinion about things once it's hold of your legs. Martha had crossed it twice on horseback, and once on foot at a shallow point a half-mile east. She wasn't at the shallow point now. She was at the bend, where the water came around the big cottonwoods, and picked up speed where the gravel gave way to cut bank, and the footing was uncertain. She looked back. She could see movement in the grass. One rider, it looked like moving in her general direction. Whether he had seen her namely, or was simply following the direction of her flight, she couldn't tell. It did not matter. What mattered was that she couldn't go back. She couldn't go, I guess, east along the bank without breaking into open ground. She couldn't go west because the cut bank dropped into deep water within 20 yards. The water was in front of her. Cold. She could feel it from the bank, that particular chill that snowmelt rivers carry even in August. The current pulled past the rocks with a sound that was almost pleasant if you weren't standing there calculating your odds. She went in, and the cold hit her like something deliberate. It is always a shock, no matter how prepared you think you are. The way cold water takes the air from your lungs and replaces it with a brief, animal panic that has nothing to do with your conscious mind. Martha gasped, found her footing on the gravel bottom, and pushed across toward the far bank. The current took her immediately. Not violently. There was no dramatic tumble, no sudden submersion, but steadily, the way a strong hand grips a wrist, pulling her downstream at a rate that was faster than she was swimming across. She was a moderate swimmer. She had grown up near a creek in Ohio, swum in it as a girl, but that was more than 2 decades behind her, and this wasn't a creek. The current was working against every stroke. For every foot she gained toward the far bank, it pushed her 2 feet downstream, and the bank along this stretch was cut high, 3-4 feet of overhanging earth above the waterline. Nothing to grab, nowhere to get out even if she reached it. The water was at her chin. She was still holding the bucket. She did not know when she had made the decision to keep holding it, or if it had been a decision at all. Her hand had simply not let go. Later she would think about this for a long time. The way the body sometimes insists on ordinary things in the middle of extraordinary circumstances, as though normalcy is its own kind of anchor. The bucket was wood dried out from the summer, and it was giving her just enough buoyancy to keep her head above the surface. Not, to be fair, much, and not reliably. I think, but enough. The current took her around the bend. She couldn't see the rider anymore. She couldn't see anything except water and the overhanging trees and a strip of pale sky above the river. Her legs were tiring fast. Cold water pulls the strength from muscles in a way that has no warning, no gradual decline, just a sudden recognition that you're working twice as hard to accomplish half as much. Her boots were filled with water. She tried to kick them off and nearly went under in the attempt. She stopped fighting well. The current is hard. Plus, I guess, older survival instinct, something she had read once in a practical guide for frontier settlers. Do not exhaust yourself fighting a river. Float when you can. Save the strength for when the bank gives you a chance. She tilted back, kept her face up, let the current carry her, and used her arms only to keep herself oriented and away from the rocks. It was the right call. It also felt terrifyingly like giving up, and the line between the two was thinner than she would have liked. She had been in the water for perhaps 4 minutes. Her whole body was numb from the chest down. The bucket was waterlogged now. Heavy, not helpful, but she still had not let go of it, and somehow the holding of it was the only thing that felt familiar. Everything else in the world had been rearranged. Thomas was dead. Her home might be burning. She was in a river with no clear way out, losing strength by the second, with cold water working patiently to finish what the morning had started. There's a moment in drowning. People who have survived it speak about this, where the fear stops, where the body moves into a kind of stunned acceptance, and the mind goes quiet in a way that's almost peaceful, and the awful arithmetic of the situation becomes very clear and very simple. Martha was approaching that moment. She could feel it coming the way you feel sleep coming when you're too exhausted to fight it anymore. She thought about Thomas, the 3 notes he always hummed. She couldn't remember the melody exactly, and that bothered her more than anything else. The idea that she might be dying with an incomplete memory of the most ordinary and beloved sound of her daily life. She was pretty much looking up at the sky when the shadow fell across the water. Something large, moving along the bank above her, keeping pace with the current. She turned her head and saw, through water-blurred eyes, through the specific distortion of a mind that was running low on everything, a horse. A rider, leaning out over, I guess, the cut bank, reaching down, and the arm was long and bare and brown in the summer light, and the voice that came down her wasn't English, and it wasn't the voice of someone calling to frighten cattle. It was the voice of someone who had seen her in the water and made a decision about it. The hand, found her wrist. Not the bucket, her wrist. Her real hand, the one that had nothing to hold, and had been grasping at water and losing. The grip was absolute, which there was no question in it, no hesitation. One moment, honestly, she was going under, and the next moment she was being lifted, impossibly it seemed, from this angle, from this position, upward along the cut bank, her body dragging across wet earth, her legs finally finding something solid, and she was out of the water and on the bank and breathing, really breathing in a way that hurt all the way down. She lay on her back in the grass above the river. The sky was enormous and blue and completely indifferent to everything that had just happened. The rider sat his horse above her. She looked up at him, and he looked down at her, and for a long moment neither of them said anything, because there wasn't thing in either of their languages that was adequate for this particular moment. He was young. She would not have been able to say exactly how young, because shock had a way of blurring the details of faces, but young. His horse was a spotted gray, and it was breathing hard, which meant he had been riding fast to reach her, which meant he had seen her in the water from some distance, and come on purpose. He was alone, as far as she could tell. He was watching her with an expression she couldn't read clearly, not hostility, but not warmth either. Something more careful than either of those things. Something that looked like a person who had just done an impulsive thing and was now quietly considering the consequences. He said something she did not understand. She lay in the grass and dripped water and did not respond because her body was entirely occupied with the business of breathing. He said it again, and this time there was a different quality to it. Not a question, not a command. Something closer to a statement of simple fact, made to no one in particular, as if he weren't allowed that the water was cold and the bank was high and a woman had very nearly not come out of the river alive. Martha thought, for what it's worth, he can't help me. On the day her husband was shot. On the day everything she had built had been torn down in a single morning. On the frontier that both of their peoples were fighting over with a ferocity that left no room for ambiguity about where anyone stood. He had seen her going under, and he had ridden to the bank and pulled her out. She did not understand it. She held it in her mind the way she had held the bucket. Not because she knew what to do with it, but because letting go wasn't something she was capable of anymore today. He dismounted. He did for what it's worth, not come close to her, but he was no longer above her on the horse, and that felt like a different kind of thing, a different kind of language. He moved to the bank and looked downstream, then back in the direction she had come from, reading the land the way someone reads it when they're calculating distance and danger and what comes next. Then he looked sort of at her again. Plus, she sat up. Her hands were shaking. The bucket actually was gone. She had let go of it, finally, somewhere in the confusion of being pulled up the bank. She looked at my opinion, at her empty hand for a moment. Then she looked at him. Plus, thank you, she said, because those are the only two words she had that came anywhere close to what she meant, and she said them not because she expected him to understand the words, but because the saying of them was for her own sake as much as his. He did not respond, but he did not leave either, and he stood between her and the river, between her and the direction she had come from, and he watched the grass line to the north with the particular stillness of someone who has spent a great deal of their life knowing exactly what dangers look like, and exactly how much attention they require. Martha wrapped her arms around herself, soaking wet and shaking, and sat in the grass above the Smoky Hill River, and did not die. The afternoon light moved across the water below. Somewhere north, her home was still standing, or it wasn't. Thomas was still in the grass where he had fallen, and that fact was going to be with her for the rest of her life, however long or short that turned out to be. Well, but she was breathing. The sky was still above her. The man who had pulled her from the river stood a few feet away and watched the horizon with serious eyes. She was alive, and for now, that was the whole story. She did not know how long she sat there before she stopped shaking. Long enough for the sun to move, and long enough for her breathing to stop being the ragged, desperate kind and become the ordinary kind again. The kind you take without thinking about it, the kind you only notice when it's recently been taken away. The grass was warm from the afternoon heat, and it dried her back and her arms slowly, though her skirt. Boots were still soaked through, and the cold clung to her legs the way cold always does once it's found its way into the bone. The young man had not left. He had not come closer either. He sat down in the grass about 10 feet away, not facing her exactly, but not turned away either. Angled, the way someone honestly sits when they're keeping watch, but did not want to appear to be watching the person beside them. He had ground-tied his horse, which stood nearby cropping grass with the business-like calm of an animal that has had an eventful afternoon and is ready to move on from it. Martha watched him the way you watch something you do not entirely understand. Carefully, without staring, taking in details one at a time, because the whole picture was too much to process at once. He basically was lean and well-built in the way that people are when they are young and spend most of their time outdoors. He wore TBH, leggings, and a plain shirt, and had a single eagle feather tied in his hair, not for ceremony by the look of it, just a piece of everyday ornamentation, the way some men wear a particular belt or a pocket watch. He had a bow across his back and a knife at his belt. He wasn't carrying it in any way that suggested threat. He, in my opinion, was simply a man sitting in grass by a river, apparently content to wait for nothing in particular. She had grown up being told things about the Cheyenne. Everyone on the frontier had been told things about the Cheyenne and about the Lakota and about every nation whose land they had come to settle on, and the things people told you were shaped largely by what those people wanted you to feel rather than what was actually true. Fear, mostly. Plus, the kind of fear that makes large groups of people easier to move in a particular direction. Martha had always had a slightly suspicious relationship with received wisdom. Her father had been a man of strong opinions, frequently contradicted by the facts, and she had grown up watching how that worked, what it cost people who accepted the story without questioning it. Still, and her husband had been shot this morning, and the men who had shot him had been Cheyenne, or she believed they had been. And this young man in front of her was Cheyenne, clearly. The mind wants to make a single story out of connected things. It requires discipline to resist that, to hold the parts separately, and not rush them into a conclusion. She resisted it. partly because of the discipline she had always applied to such things, and partly because this man had pulled her out of a river when he could have ridden past, and whatever story she was going to make out of the day, that fact had to be somewhere in it. He said something, not to her, more to the air, the way people sometimes speak when they're thinking out loud. She caught one word that she thought she had heard before at the trading post, though she couldn't place the meaning. He glanced at her briefly, then looked back toward the north. "I don't speak actually Cheyenne," she said, which her voice came out steadier than she expected. "I'm sorry." He looked at her with an expression that suggested he wasn't surprised by this. "Do you tbh speak any English?" she asked. He considered this for a moment. Then, he said, very carefully, as if producing the words from somewhere they did not naturally live, Martha almost laughed, not from humor, from the particular relief of a small, unexpected thing that's almost manageable, in a day full of things that aren't. "Some is enough," she said. "Some is more like than I've." He did not smile, but something in his posture shifted very slightly in a way that wasn't unfriendly. His name, as close as she could render it in her own mouth, was something she eventually shortened in her mind to catch as the wind, a name she did not learn until later, passed to her through halting exchanges and the occasional word she recognized from the trading post. He was, she gathered, younger than she had initially thought. 20, I guess, perhaps 21. He had the seriousness of someone older, but young people on the frontier, both his and hers, had a way of aging quickly in their eyes even when the rest of them had not caught up yet. He had been riding alone. She gathered this much from the way he kept looking at the horizon to the east, not nervously, but with the attentive patience of someone waiting for something to appear that he expected to appear eventually. He wasn't part of the group that had come to her homestead. This she believed, though she couldn't have fully explained why. It was something in the way he had not approached from that direction, and something in the way he had reacted when she had come around the river bend. Not the controlled non-surprise of a man executing a plan, but the sharper, instinctive response of someone who encountered something unexpected and made a snap decision. He had decided to help her. That, I guess, was what she kept returning to. He had, been riding east along the cut bank. She had worked this out from the direction he had come from, and the way his horse's hooves had marked the soft ground at the top of the bank. Going somewhere, moving with purpose. Then he had seen her in the water, and he had stopped being on his way somewhere and become instead the man who was going to pull a white woman out of the Smoky Hill River. He had not hesitated about it. From what she could tell, there was no evidence of a long deliberation in the hoof prints at the bank. He had just done it. She thought about this for a long time while she sat in the grass and dried out. The sun was getting lower. The shadows from the cottonwoods along the river were reaching east across the grass, long and thin, pointing toward something. She needed to think about what came next, which was a task her mind kept sliding away from, because next required confronting the full weight of the day, and the full weight of the day was considerable. Thomas was dead. She kept saying this to herself in the flattest possible way, the most factual way, because the factual version was the only one she could hold without shutting down entirely. Thomas was dead, and she had no idea what had happened to her home, and she was wet and cold and sitting a mile downriver from where she had started with a Cheyenne warrior she could barely communicate with, and the frontier in the late summer of 1868 wasn't a place where a woman alone with no shelter, no horse, and no weapon had good prospects after dark. She said this to herself, too. Not as despair, as inventory. What did she have? What, I guess, did she not have? Plus, what needed to happen before the sun went down? This was the thing about Martha Calloway that Thomas had always admired and occasionally found maddening. She was, at her core, a practical person. She could feel the grief coming. It was enormous. It was waiting just behind the part of her mind that was currently doing inventory, and she knew that when it arrived, it was going to be the size of a season. But grief, she had learned from earlier losses in her life, wasn't something you could manage in the middle of a crisis. It was something you had to earn the space for. She would grieve Thomas fully and properly, but she had to survive the afternoon first. She turned to the young man. "I need to know if my home is still standing," she said slowly, watching his face to see how much of the English he was catching. "The homestead north. Can you see from here?" He looked at her for a moment. Then, he stood up in a single, easy motion, the kind of easy that belongs to people who live physically, and walked to his horse. He mounted and turned east along the bank for about 50 yards, then stopped on a small rise where the tree line broke, and you could see a long way across the open country. He stood there for a while, looking north. When he came back, he said something, and then searched for the English word for what he meant, and the word he found was standing. Her home was still standing. She closed her eyes for 3 seconds. "Thank you," she said again. And then, because, well, she needed to say something more than that, because thank you wasn't large enough for the sum of what had happened in the past few hours. He was a good man. My husband. He was a good man. She wasn't sure why she said this to him, of all people, in this moment. Perhaps because he was there. Perhaps because Thomas deserved to be spoken of by someone immediately before the world moved on, and this young man was the only witness the afternoon had provided. He was quiet for a moment. Then, he said, with the care of someone using a language that doesn't fully fit their mouth, "I know." She did not ask him how he knew. She thought about it later, whether he had seen Thomas, whether he had heard about what had happened, whether he was simply offering the English words that seemed appropriate for what she had said. She chose not to ask. Some TBH, things are better accepted than examined. The light was definitely lower now. A decision needed to be made. She stood up, which took more effort than she expected. Her legs were stiff from the cold, the sitting, and her whole body had begun to report its inventory of complaints now that the immediate urgency had passed. Her right knee was banged from something in the river, she realized. She had not noticed it until this moment. She looked north toward her home. Then she looked east, then west, reading the land the way she had learned to read it over 11 years of living in it. For what it's worth, riders who had come that morning. She had seen too. Oh, there could have been more. She did not know where they were now. She did not know if they had left or if they were still in the area. She did not know if going back to the homestead was safe or if it was the worst idea she had ever had. She looked at the young man. He had not left. He was watching her with the same calm, evaluating attention he had maintained throughout, and something in the quality of his watching, the patience of it, the absence of any urgency in the direction of away from here, told her something. Not everything, but something. "Will you come with me?" she asked. "To the homestead." This was, objectively, a strange request. She knew this. She was like asking a Cheyenne warrior to accompany her back to her homestead on the day that men from his nation had killed her husband. The arithmetic of it did not work out into anything comfortable. And, for what it's worth, yet she asked it because the honest assessment of her situation was that going back alone in the failing light, not knowing what was there or not there, was a prospect that felt considerably more dangerous than the company she was presently in. He had already given her a data point about his intentions, and it was the most reliable data point she had. He thought about it. She could see him thinking, not in the visible verbal way, but in the particular stillness of someone who's weighing something real. Then he turned his horse north and looked back at her. She understood this to mean yes. They went north together through the tall grass in the long afternoon light, Martha on foot and the young warrior on his spotted horse, moving through the country. That belonged to both of them, and neither of them, in a quiet that neither of them tried to fill because there wasn't thing either of them could say that would have been adequate. The grass bent in the wind, and the river fell away behind them. The first long shadows of the evening stretched across the ground at their feet. When the homestead came into view, the house still standing, the barn still standing, the garden still there, everything exactly as she had left it except for the absence of the one person who made it mean anything, she stopped walking. Look, he stopped too. She looked at the house for a long time. Then she looked north, toward the fence line, toward the place she couldn't see from here, but knew was there where Thomas had gone that morning and where he still was. She said nothing. There wasn't thing to say that the moment had not already said on her behalf. The young warrior sat his horse beside her and did not speak and did not leave. The sky above, in my opinion, the homestead was turning the particular deep orange of a late summer sunset on the plains, the kind that look painted, the kind that makes the land below it look like something from a story rather than the actual world where actual things happen to actual people. Martha Calloway, had lived 11 years in this country, and it had never looked so foreign to her as it did in this moment. She straightened her spine. She squared her shoulders, which she did both of these things deliberately, consciously, as an actable rather than a natural expression of how she felt. Because sometimes you have to build the posture before the feeling inside it's any chance of being real. Then, she walked toward her home. He followed at a distance, close enough to matter, far enough to give her what space she needed. And if there was any grace in the entire wreckage of that day, it was this: she did not have to walk toward it alone. The house had not been touched, and she walked through every room to be sure. Not quickly, not with the frantic energy of someone looking for danger, but slowly, methodically, the way she did most things. The main room, the kitchen, the bedroom, the small back storeroom where she kept the preserved goods and the winter supplies. Everything exactly pretty much as it had been left. The bread dough she had set to rise that morning was still on the kitchen table under its cloth, risen fully now and beginning to collapse at the top because it had been left too long. The coffee pot was on the stove. Thomas's spare jacket was hanging on the peg by the door. These ordinary, basically, things had a particular cruelty to them in this moment. The profound indifference of domestic objects to what had happened to the people who owned them. She stood TBH in the middle of the kitchen and breathed. Outside, she could see through the window that the young warrior had dismounted and tied his horse to the fence post near the garden. He actually was standing near the well, not doing anything in particular, just standing. It struck her, I guess, as a thing she couldn't have fully anticipated this morning. That before the sun was down, she would be grateful for the presence of a person she had no shared language with, standing near her well while she stood in her kitchen and counted the things that were left. She found a spare rifle above the door, where it always was. She took it down, checked it, set on the kitchen table. Not for any, specific reason except that it made the inventory feel more complete. Then she went back outside, and she needed to go to the fence line. She knew this. Every part of her that wanted to survive the next several days understood that leaving Thomas out in the grass overnight wasn't something she could do for practical reasons and for reasons that had nothing to do with practicality. But the light was going fast now, and going out there in the failing light, without knowing what was still in the area, wasn't something she was willing to do alone. She looked at the young man, and, "North," she said. "I need to go north. Plus, to where She stopped. Started again. "I need to bring him home." He looked north along the fence line. He looked back at her. She saw the calculation in his face, the same kind of practical assessment she had been doing all afternoon, weighing what the light had left in it against what the land might still contain. He wasn't naive about the risks any more than she was. He understood the territory they were both standing in probably better than she did. He nodded. He untied his horse and mounted. They found Thomas at the north fence, as she had known they would. She actually had prepared herself for this, as well as a person can prepare themselves for such a thing, which is to say not very well at all. Preparation and reality have a way of being very different countries. She stood at the edge of the grass and looked at him for a while, and the young warrior stayed back a respectful distance that she was grateful for without knowing how to express it. She did what needed to be done. She wasn't going to detail it here, even in the private record of her own memory, because there are some things that belong only to the people who live them. What she could say was that it took longer than she thought it would, and less time than it felt like, and by the time it was done the stars were beginning to appear in the east, and the prairie was full of the particular silence it gets at night when the wind drops and every sound carries a long way. She had help. Plus, she had not asked for it. For what it's worth, young warrior had simply been there when she needed an extra set of hands, and he had helped without comment. Without any expression she could read as pity or condescension or any of the things she would have found difficult to accept. He helped the way a neighbor helps, practically, quietly, without making it into something larger than what it was. A task, a thing that needed doing. Basically, two people doing it. She thought about this afterward. She thought about it many times in the days and weeks and years that followed. The pretty much Cheyenne did not owe her anything. She was a settler woman on contested land, and whatever the larger politics of that. And there's a great deal of larger politics, none of it simple, none of it clean. In the personal and immediate sense, there was no obligation. No debt. He sort of had pulled her from the river because she was drowning, and now he was helping her because she needed it, and neither of those things had anything to do with what she could do for him in return. She had nothing to offer. Plus, he had not asked for anything. This confused her in a way that she found she couldn't resolve into something simple. The frontier taught you transaction. You did for your neighbor because your neighbor would do for you, because that was how anyone survived out here, because winter came, and illness came, and equipment broke, and the simple math of mutual dependency made generosity into a form of enlightened self-interest. But this wasn't that. This was something she did not have a comfortable category for. She filed it away. She would understand it better later. Right now, she had other things to attend to. Back at kind of the homestead, she made a fire, partly for warmth, which she genuinely needed after the river, and partly because fire at night on the frontier had a psychological function that wasn't entirely rational, but was entirely real. It said, people are here. It said, this place is occupied. And it said all of this to whatever was out in the dark with more authority than she personally felt capable of projecting at this particular moment in her life. She made coffee. Plus, she did not ask the young warrior if he wanted any. She simply made 2 cups, the way she always made 2 cups, and set one on the step outside the door where he was sitting with his back against the wall, watching the darkness. He looked at the cup for a moment. Then he took it. She sat, on the step a few feet away from him, and they drank their coffee in silence, which was the most natural thing that had happened all day, and also, somehow, the strangest. The fire threw, I guess, orange light across the yard. The horse stood at the fence post, dozing. The stars were very bright, the way they are on the plains where there's no other light for 100 miles in any direction to compete with them. She said, "Why did you help me?" She wasn't sure she expected an answer. She asked it the way you sometimes ask things out loud, when you're really asking them of yourself, processing them through the act of putting them into words. She was also genuinely curious. She had been genuinely curious about it since the moment she had come up from the river bank gasping, and the curiosity had only grown as the day had progressed. He was quiet for a while. She watched a spark float up from the fire and disappear. Then, TBH, he said, choosing the English words one at a time with the care of someone assembling something from parts that do not entirely fit. "I saw you. In the water." "Yes," she said. "You were holding." He made a shape with his free hand, a rounded carrying gesture. "Something. Small." "The bucket," she said. "Kind of." He nodded slowly. "You were holding it. Going under. But holding it still." He looked at the fire. That was basically, he searched for the word and did not find it. He said something in Cheyenne instead, a single word that she had no way to translate, but that she heard clearly, and the shape of it stayed with her for years afterward. She thought about what she had looked like from the bank above the river. A woman going under in a current, and the thing she was holding on to, the last piece of ordinary that she had not yet released, was a water bucket. She thought about what that looked like from the outside. She thought about what it might mean to a person watching it. "I didn't want to let go," she said. It sounded insufficient when she heard it out loud. He nodded again, as though this made complete sense to him, as though it was the only explanation anyone needed. They sat with that for a while. Later, she would think that this was the moment she began to understand something about the shape of the day, not just what had happened, but why it had happened the way it had. There are moments in a life that look, from the outside, like random collisions of circumstance. A man actually riding east along a river and a woman going under in the current in the same place at the same time. But, from my opinion, the inside, from the place where a person carries their sense of what things mean, those moments have a different quality. They feel like something, not fate. Exactly. Martha had a complicated relationship with the word fate, which struck her as a thing people said when they wanted the universe to have been paying attention to them specifically. Not fate. Something more impersonal than that. More like a confluence. 2 things that were already in motion, finding each other at the intersection. She had been in motion since morning. Plus grief and fear and cold water and the pure animal insistence of a body that wasn't finished with the world yet. He had been in motion since before she knew him, carrying his own history and his own purposes through the same contested country. They kind of had arrived at the same bend in the same river. She was alive because of that, because of, honestly, the confluence, and because he had made a choice, and because her hand had not let go of a wooden bucket even at the point where letting go would have been the easier thing. The fire burned low. She went inside and brought out the bread she had baked, the backup loaf, the one. that had risen correctly, not the collapsed one from that morning, and broken in half, and gave him half. He looked at it, and he took it. The Amin ate bread by the fire, which the night was warm and full of crickets, and the distant sound of the river, still moving in the dark and different and relentless and entirely unaware of what it had almost done. She did not ask him to stay, and he did not offer to. At some actually point before the fire went entirely to coals, he rose, checked on his horse, and made some adjustment to the tie that she couldn't see clearly in the dark. She understood this to be the preparation of departure. She did not try to stop it. She stood up. "I'll be all right," she said. Not to reassure him. Exactly. She wasn't sure she was the right person to be offering reassurance to anyone tonight, but because it was important to say it out loud. Because the saying of it was the first step toward it being true. He looked at her steadily for a moment. Then he said something she couldn't follow, which then he said in English, "I know." He rode east into the dark. She stood in the firelight and watched until she couldn't see him anymore. Then she stood actually there while longer anyway, listening to the sound of hoofbeats getting smaller in the grass. She went inside. She locked the door, which she knew was more gesture than security. She sat at the kitchen table with Thomas's jacket across her lap, and the rifle within reach, and the lamp burning low, and she stayed awake through the hours before dawn, the way you stay awake when you aren't yet able to trust the darkness enough to close your eyes. In the morning, she would go to the nearest neighboring homestead, 6 miles east, and tell them what had happened. She would send word to the army post. She honestly would begin the long, terrible process of figuring out what came next, alone on the frontier in the middle, I think, of a conflict that she had not started and couldn't stop and had no good answers for. But in the morning was the morning. Tonight was tonight. She sat at the table. She pressed her hand flat against the wood surface, feeling the grain under her palm, solid and real. Thomas had built this table the first year they were here, out of lumber they had hauled from 2 towns over, because he wanted it to be proper. He wanted her to have something proper in this rough country. He had been very pleased with how it came out. She had teased him about being proud of a table. The table was still there, and she was still there. She basically sat with this for a very long time in the silence of the house, with the lamp burning and the fire outside going to ash, and the long night moving slowly toward whatever the morning was going to bring. Somewhere to the east, a Cheyenne warrior was riding through the dark with a cup of coffee's worth of her hospitality and half a loaf of her bread, carrying back into his own world whatever he had taken from a day. She did not know his world. She did not know what he would tell his people, if he told them anything at all. She did not know whether this was a thing that would ripple outward or a thing that would disappear into the vastness of the country, the way so many things did. She knew only what she knew, that she had gone into the river and come out of it, that she had been helped by the person the least likely to help her on the worst day of her life, that she was sitting at her husband's table with his jacket in her lap, and the fire cooling outside. She was breathing, and the world was continuing to exist around her, whether she was ready for it or not. The Cheyenne sort of had a word she had not understood, said over a cup of coffee by a low fire. It wasn't a word she would ever fully translate, but she had heard it. Plus, she had heard it the way you hear something that was meant for you, even if the language isn't your own. She held it. Plus, she would hold it for the rest of her life, the way she had held the bucket, past the point of reason, past the point where holding on made any logical sense, simply because some things weren't meant to be let go. The lamp burned. The stars moved. Martha Calloway sat in her kitchen and did not stop.